Right, so despite attacks in Gaza, the West Bank, Yemen, Lebanon, Syria, Israel has apparently run out of wars to keep Netanyahu's backside safe in power, it seems. So this time, they've decided to invent one. The IDF is now crying about a developing threat from Iraq. The loyal papers print it like scripture, but nobody mentions that Iraq hasn't attacked Israel once. Not the government, not the militias, not anyone. The only planes crossing that border have Israeli flags on them. Israeli news outlet Maariv, however, says it's about defending the home front. But in the small print, it's 5.5 billion shekels for a new wall and a few well-connected contractors. Well, where's that money coming from with Israel's economy increasingly going south then? This isn't security policy, it's crisis cosplay. A state so addicted to war it's now fighting its own imagination. Netanyahu says he's keeping Israel safe, but what he's really keeping safe is himself. And the lie that Israel's still in control and only he can protect it. But when you start bombing ghosts, you've really lost the plot though, haven't you? Right, so Israel is inventing another war. Netanyahu has had a funny dream, and for all we know, it could well have been one of those funny dreams, given what is being spoken about now. But this time, the enemy isn't Hamas or Hezbollah or the Houthis, it's Iraq, a country that hasn't fired a single verified shot at Israel, that shares no border with it, and that is still trying to rebuild from the last American war that flattened it. And yet, according to Israel's security establishment, Baghdad now sits on the edge of launching a regional assault through Iranian-backed militias. Oh, so it's back to Iran again then, is it? The claim appeared in Maariv on the 24th of October, and it's been attributed to sources in the Northern Command. Those sources said the IDF and the Mossad were preparing for a developing threat to the Israeli home front from Iraq. It's the kind of line that has kept Israel on a permanent war footing for 2 years. Vague, unverifiable, politically priceless, though. Iraq as a state has never attacked Israel. A few militias based in Iraq, mainly within the self-styled Islamic Resistance in Iraq umbrella, have claimed occasional drone launches in solidarity with Gaza, but none have actually been independently verified as causing damage inside Israel. The only confirmed hostilities between the two countries run the other way. Israeli airstrikes on Iraqi soil, first in 2019 against Popular Mobilization Forces depots, and again earlier this year under Operation Kalavi, noted by Maariv itself. Maariv described Kalavi as an Israeli Air Force strike on logistics centres in Iran on the Iraqi border, said to be used by Iran-funded militias, but it's been questioned very heavily as to whether it struck inside Iraq as well. Reporting has been deliberately ambiguous on that event. So the balance of force is not in doubt, though, at the end of the day. The only attacks that actually happened were Israeli. The same Maariv article said Esmail Qani, the commander of Iran's Quds force, had recently visited Iraq and met militia leaders. No evidence was offered for that, though. It also described a scenario in which those militias might one day launch missiles or drones at Israel and even attempt a ground manoeuvre that will start in Iraq and head to Syria, and from there possibly to the Israel-Jordan border. That's roughly 1,000 kilometres of desert and mountain through two other sovereign states. In military terms, it's nonsense. In political terms, it's a gift, though, isn't it? A hypothetical enemy is the easiest kind to fight. But then for those of us who remember what's been said by Netanyahu on the matter of Greater Israel, such a notion would be entirely in keeping within that doctrine. Within the same column inches of Maariv, though, the Ministry of Defence announced something far more tangible, though. A 5.5 billion shekel project to build a 425-kilometre multi-layered barrier along Israel's eastern frontier, from the southern Golan Heights to the Samar Sands north of Eilat. The tenders were already issued, the contractors chosen, the language bureaucratic. Looking ahead to the emerging threat, said Director General Amir Baram, we must act with a sense of urgency and strengthen the strategic grip on the eastern border. That phrase, strategic grip, is the tell. This isn't about protection, it's about possession. The wall is being sold as a defensive measure against Iraq, but the fine print describes an integrated system of settlements, roads, and industrial growth engines. It's a colonisation plan with a security budget, in other words. This is how Israel's wars now begin, you see. Not with an attack, but with a press release. Not with evidence, but with a contract. Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, Iran, now Iraq, each front introduced through the same ritual. Anonymous officials predicting an imminent threat, a government promising preemption, and the West just nods along and pays for it. It's a theatre of anticipation. Israel no longer reacts to war, it forecasts it like the weather. Manufactures the proof and builds the infrastructure to cash it in, driving up national debt and US borrowing to pay for it all. The pattern is clear in the record. On the 1st of April last year, Israel bombed Iran's consulate in Damascus, you might recall, killing at least 7 IRGC and Syrian officials. It was an act of war on diplomatic soil. 2 months later, Iran replied with a 2-day missile and drone barrage aimed only at military sites, Operation True Promise 1. No civilian casualties, no follow-up strikes. Tehran declared the matter closed. Israel called it proof of Iranian aggression. And the same script played out later on in Yemen when the Houthis blockaded Israeli-linked shipping in protest over Gaza, and Israel decided to attack them for that, responding with air raids on Hodeidah and other areas, rarely ever impacting the Houthis themselves, who were very mobile, but certainly killing a great many civilians, as I'm sure you're aware of. The blockade only ended up widening, and Israel called that escalation Iranian coordination. In Lebanon, Israel's daily air raids, despite a supposed almost year-long ceasefire, are now routine. Each strike produces another justification for the next one, cause and effect just switching places. Inside Israel, the military's running on fumes, though. The IDF have just told the Knesset Finance Committee in the last few days that it was not prepared for new wars. It didn't have the money for it. Without an emergency budget, it can't be paid for. It's a story I covered just yesterday, actually. Defence spending has swallowed more than 9% of GDP. The extra cost of simultaneous operations since 2023 has come in at roughly 80 billion shekels. Generals warn of manpower exhaustion. Reservists are on their 3rd call-ups, yet the government is still authorising new fronts here. So this isn't strategy, it's desperation for survival. Netanyahu's coalition needs perpetual crisis to stay alive. The genocide in Gaza destroyed Israel's moral capital abroad and split opinion at home. The economy is slowing, the courts are circling corruption cases, even the generals are now leaking dissent to the media. A phantom enemy solves all of that because fear buys time. Time keeps that coalition together, and every minute bought in panic can be converted into public money for construction and arms, or even more settlements. That's why Barham called the Eastern Barrier a national mission. It binds the military budget to the building industry, and both to the myth of make-believe dangers. But there's another layer to this as well. Israel can't reach Iraq without crossing Jordan or Syria. Jordan is effectively an Israeli dependency anyway, supplied with Israeli water as well as water from Syria, which is possibly under Israeli control, gas and intelligence as well. Its monarchy relies on Western protection and fears Israel's wrath more than its own public. Syria, by contrast, is already being bombed weekly by Israel as one of its ready-made war fronts, even though the Al-Qaeda cast-offs now running the show there wanted ties with Israel, not war, but ties there won't keep Netanyahu in power. So any strikes on Iraqi militias would in reality be another incursion into Syrian airspace, or even Jordanian now. Israel knows that. The Maariv story is the legal and moral groundwork for those future violations. Iran's position, meanwhile, is verifiably defensive. Iran's Iraqi-aligned militias largely sat out the June Iran-Israel conflict. There were no direct attacks on Israel from Iraqi soil. Even Western analysts say Baghdad avoided involvement at the time. The ECFR's 2025 briefing described Iraq as caught between Tehran and Washington, but seeking to avoid direct war. Yet Israeli newspapers talk about Iranian proxies massing in Iraq. The difference between restraint and rhetoric is the distance between a fact and a budget line. But the deeper motive isn't military at all. It's psychological and it's economic. A country that defines itself through threat needs a threat to define itself. Every new front revives the illusion of control. Netanyahu's own terror is political extinction. The Gaza genocide has destroyed his image abroad and at home. His ministers compete to sound more apocalyptic than he already does. If he ends a war, he loses the coalition. If he starts another, he buys himself time. Iraq is his next time buyer, in other words. The Barrier Project converts that anxiety into contracts. It's the latest proof that Israeli security policy has become a self-licking machine. War creates fear, fear creates funding, funding sustains war. There's a term for this in Israeli strategic culture. They call it mabam, the campaign between wars. It used to mean keeping enemies off balance. Now it means keeping the public distracted instead. When generals brief that Iranian proxies are active in Iraq, what they're really announcing is another round of state-funded theatre. The military pretends to defend, the contractors pretend to build, the politicians pretend to lead. Everything's a pretense. Everyone gets paid except the truth. What makes this moment different is that the mask is slipping. The IDF's admission of weakness was not supposed to be public. Outlets such as Naharnet and the Jerusalem Post reported it because the budget request leaked. The numbers don't lie, though. Israel is fighting on 5 fronts, running an almost double-digit defence deficit, and facing war crime scrutiny at the International Court of Justice. When a state this overstretched starts inventing new enemies, it's not projecting power, it's confessing to the collapse. The Maariv article shows how policy manufacture works, though. You cite an Iranian name, Khani. You invoke militias, Hamas, Kataib, Hezbollah, Harakat al-Nujabah. You describe capabilities, long-range drones. You admit none of this has actually happened, though, but you build a 5.5 billion shekel wall just in case. Then you remind readers that these militias once targeted US forces, as if that alone makes them Israel's war now. It's storytelling for contractors. But it's also deterrence through PR. Announce the wall, hope the announcement itself substitutes for security. Jordan's role exposes another truth. The kingdom isn't just scared, it's captured. By walling its side of the valley, Israel is turning Jordan into a buffer colony, a corridor for overflights, intelligence exchange, and border policing. A man will just call it cooperation like they always do. Tel Aviv will call it sovereignty on their part. But the physical wall cements that imbalance. The project's official description lists Zionist security settlement alongside security civilian infrastructure, and that pairing tells you everything. The border is not being fortified, it's being absorbed. So this isn't a departure from the old Greater Israel dream at all, actually. It's perhaps a new and more administrative version of it. You don't redraw the maps anymore, you redraw tenders instead. You expand not by invasion but by integration. Power lines, roads, surveillance grids. The Eastern Barrier achieved through engineering what the 20th century never could through war. It extends control without admitting conquest. And yet the contradiction is blatant. The government preaching security is the same one whose actions have made Israel less secure than at any point in its history. Gaza is rubble, but it's not pacified. Hezbollah still exists. The Houthis still control the Red Sea choke point and can exercise that control whenever they wish. Iran hasn't been deterred. They kicked Israel's arse for 12 days straight. Inside Israel, the draft burden and economic collapse are fracturing the social contract. What keeps the state functioning is inertia and fear, and both are finite resources. When Maariv talks about an emerging threat from Iraq, what it really describes is the Israeli government's emerging terror of accountability. The world's seeing through the self-defense myth. The ICJ's interim ruling on starvation warfare in Gaza opened the door to complicity cases. Domestic protests are returning. The Iraq phantom is Netanyahu's latest decoy. As long as the spotlight points east, no one looks at Rafah. No one looks at the food convoys still blocked from getting in, or the economy that happens to be bleeding out. There's a phrase soldiers use when a mission loses meaning. We're just burning daylight, they say. That's what Israel's strategy has now become, a campaign to fill the hours between the last atrocity and the next excuse. The army says it needs another wall, the government says it needs another war, but the only thing either of them are defending is their own fiction. The consequence is already becoming more and more visible. Investors are pulling capital, draft dodging is rising, the diplomatic circle that once called Israel indispensable now calls it unpredictable. Even Washington has stopped pretending the wars are sustainable. When your allies begin to question your competence rather than your cause, you've crossed a line that no amount of money can fix for you anymore. So the Eastern Barrier will be built, by the look of it. The headlines will fade and the desert will fill with concrete. But the fear it's meant to contain is inside the country, not outside it. Israel, much as it did to Gaza, is now walling itself in. Against reality, against consequence, against the day when even its own citizens stop believing the next threat briefing. Netanyahu's last war isn't with Iran or Iraq or anyone beyond the horizon, it's with the truth. And that's the one enemy Netanyahu can't bomb into silence. For more on the dire state of Israel's economy, making the affordability of all of this the biggest joke of all right now, check out this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe if you haven't done so already, so as to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content, as well as spreading the word and helping to support the channel at the same time, which is very much appreciated, holding power to account for ordinary working class people. I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.